We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Dr. Wilmer, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Agreement for a change. Trump and Biden, they share their distrust of China. This year's presidential race, it's been dominated by a number of crises, two of which are COVID and the impact of the economic recession. But, there's been a lot of vitriolic exchange over which candidate is most unfit for public office. But one thing that they seem to agree on is their distrust of China. And so where will that conversation take us? For insight, we turn to our next guest. He's a frequent collaborator with all major news outlets and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure. Glad to be here, as always.
We're 2 weeks away from the election. The rhetoric is ratcheting up. Donald Trump and Joe Biden seem to be trying to one-up each other on who has the greater level of mistrust or distrust of China. Your thoughts here?
Well, I think it's important to note that often the way things are debated, especially during presidential elections, is very different than what actually pans out when it comes to the presidency. For example, the most recent example would be Donald Trump, right? We've been told from, long before Trump was even elected, that Trump was close to Russia. He was sympathetic to Russia. And look at the Trump presidency. We have seen so many treaties ripped up, the INF treaty ripped up, the Clear Skies treaty ripped up. We now hear that they will not be renewing the START treaty, all the treaties that were key in de-escalating the arms race and ending the Cold War. Which will, the ripping up of these treaties is probably going to result on forcing Russia to spend a lot more money on its military and further polarizing Europe. It's going to be a bad scene. Trump sent weapons to Ukraine, lethal weapons to the Ukraine folks now in Belarus. There's a whole situation where there's, folks, right on Russia's border that are trying to destabilize Belarus. So Trump has not been at all sympathetic to Russia and Putin. And you can almost argue that perhaps the allegation that he was soft on Russia and Putin is what forced his hand and forced him to be even more hostile than the Obama administration was. The other thing that is worth noting, if you go back to the 1960 presidential election when Richard Nixon ran against John F. Kennedy. During that election, John F. Kennedy raked Nixon over the coals, saying that Nixon was not doing enough to fight against Fidel Castro, and that Nixon was letting the Cubans set up a communist regime 90 miles south of the United States, and just raked him over the coals for that. Well, what was going on behind the scenes was that Nixon, as the outgoing vice president, was planning the Bay of Pigs invasion, and Kennedy was actually in on those discussions. So it was all smoke and mirrors, right? After Kennedy took office, almost, just quickly afterwards, he had the Bay of Pigs invasion. So Kennedy knew that the Bay of Pigs invasion was in the works. And Nixon was one of the key architects of the Bay of Pigs invasion. But yet, in front of the cameras, Kennedy presented himself as the more anti-Cuban candidate. And Nixon was on the defensive trying to explain that he wasn't soft on Castro, but it was all smoke and mirrors. Behind the scenes, both candidates knew what was actually going on, what U.S. foreign policy would be. So at the end of the day, the actual results of elections cannot exactly be so clear. Right now, yes, the candidates are trying to one-up each other on who's more hostile to China. I have a feeling, though, that in the back room, leading figures in the Democratic Party, leading figures in the Republican Party know what upcoming moves will be taken against or towards China in terms of U.S. policy, and that both candidates and both parties are in on those discussions. Now, at the same time, if Biden comes into office being just lampooned by Trump as soft on China, that may force his hand to prove himself. He may take more hostile actions against China. If you look at the history of the Cold War, it tended to be the Democrats who started wars, right? It was the Korean War was started by Harry Truman, a Democrat who was being accused of losing China, right? The Vietnam War was escalated by Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat who was accused of being soft on communism. Then it was actually the Republican Party that was the party of hardline anti-communism under Richard Nixon that recognized China. So, and it, often when you put one party on the defensive about being soft on this country or other, they do the opposite move to prove themselves. Whereas somebody who is known to be a vehement enemy of some country, they are the ones that are actually able to move ahead and establish some level of diplomacy and improve U.S. relations.
Joe Biden and a crime bill is another example of to counter the Republican rhetoric of being soft on crime. We wind up with Joe Biden and a crime bill.
Indeed, that's a very good example.
The other thing, Caleb, when I look at it right now, once a dog learns a trick, he'll do that trick over and over again. During the Trump administration, and I think it's relative to what we're talking about, the intelligence community and the foreign policy machine learned the more we beat Trump over the head and say he loves Russia, the more he'll have to push back to say, no, I don't. Or he doesn't have to, but he will be inclined to do something. So as of right now, the whole Hunter Biden thing appears to be mostly partisan. Now, there are independents like me who look at it and say, I've been reporting on this for a long time. And yeah, the Biden family is corrupt. It's fairly obvious. But as far as right now in the news, it is put forth as something that is partisan, right? But I think, let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm not convinced Biden's going to win. I don't know who's going to win, but let's just say Biden wins. Don't you think that the same intelligence community will say, okay, we had Russiagate for Trump. Now, Biden's son Hunter's obviously been up to no good in China, or at least enriching himself through China. We will constantly go after Biden for that. We'll push him, and that's the blunt object we'll use to turn Biden into the most anti-China candidate that's ever been, and just use that continually throughout his career, and maybe even, compromise. I mean, that's something they can threaten him with and say, well, there is some evidence that your son's dirty in China. Would hate to see that get out. So what are your thoughts, Caleb?
Well, I think one thing you can observe about the Obama administration in particular, not really all of the Democratic Party, but the Obama administration in particular, was that they had a tie. They were very closely aligned with the intelligence agencies, and that on the part of the Obama administration and the intelligence agencies, there was a desperation to build up U.S. influence in China. Because it's the Chinese Communist Party, which is the ruling party, has 90 million members. 90 million is not a small number. And when you have 90 million people, there is going to be big gaps between what they believe and think and how they want to move ahead. And it's widely known that there are, especially now, a lot of hardline Marxist-Leninist factions in the Chinese Communist Party. But there are also many factions in the Chinese Communist Party that are blatantly pro-American and pro-Western, and that Jiang Zemin actually said the goal of the Chinese Communist Party was to adopt the Western system at one point. Well, the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, says the exact opposite. But there is widespread gaps in opinion among Chinese communists. So, there is an institution set up by the Ford Foundation called the Institute for Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. It's paid for by the Ford Foundation, which is a CIA linked. Works closely with the National Endowment for Democracy, and they represent themselves as a Chinese Communist Party think tank, but they are trying to push that wing of the Chinese Communist Party that is sympathetic to the West. Whereas, there are other institutions, and that Obama, he made statements throughout his presidency. He made a point of praising a best-selling science fiction novel in China. I think it was The Three-Body Problem or something to that effect. And he praised it, and he made a point of saying that he was reading this science fiction novel. It was like the Harry Potter of China, like the best-selling book that everyone was reading. Obama made a point of saying, I'm reading that book. He would give speeches where he would praise China for having the world's first civil service examination. He would quote Confucius, and he was trying to send the message that China need not be afraid of the United States, and trying to build up the influence of pro-American institutions in China. And I think that was the strategy. The more influence the USA could develop within China, the more the United States could kind of restrain China and have influence over there. Whereas the Trump administration, their strategy for dealing with China seems to be building a wall. I mean, they just want to build a big wall, right? I mean, it's not a literal wall, but they want to, just block off China, right? Just isolate them, right? Create a situation in global trade where your choice is trade with the United States or trade with China, right? They're not interested in trying to influence within China. They're not interested in perhaps pushing one wing of the Chinese Communist Party over the other. They just want to put up a big wall. You're with America or you're with China. There's no middle ground. That's a very different strategy of doing things. And I think that is apparent. Now, what's not clear, though, is that Obama's attitude toward China was not universal within the Democratic Party. And in fact, I would say that, that some of the further left wings of the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders and folks that are closer to the AFL-CIO are actually more hostile to China than Obama was, right? And that the AOC left wing, the squad, is actually in some ways they favor harsher politics toward China than Obama did. So it's not as simple as one might think. I think that China at this point it has a dual character in the American mind. To liberals who don't like China, China is a country where the government is authoritarian and out of control, and big corporations make a lot of money. So, they lampoon Trump for having business deals over there, alleging that perhaps some products associated with the Trump product lines are actually made in China, et cetera. Whereas to conservatives, China is a communist authoritarian regime that crushes the great free market aspirations and is trying to impose Marxism. So of course they accuse Joe Biden, because he talks about working families, because he's critical of the police state, of being a communist who's soft on China. Well, the reality is China is neither, right? I mean, China is China, right? That I think it was Winston Churchill who said the Soviet Union was a mystery wrapped in an enigma. Well, to the American political establishment, China is a mystery wrapped in an enigma. It's not a Cold War communist caricature. It's not a right-wing fascist authoritarian corporate state. It's neither of those things. It's China. It is a unique entity that the American political establishment is desperately trying to understand.
So with that, as we are 2 weeks away from the election, does the U.S. election do you see the outcome of the election changing the U.S. stance and policy direction towards China, or is it not party driven? It's U.S. foreign policy elite / security driven, if that makes sense.
If you pay attention to what the candidates are saying, the implication would be no, that we would continue on this anti-China, direction. There would be more tariffs, more trade wars, more sanctions, more threats, more hostility, that both candidates seem committed to the current White House policies towards China. However, as we know, that U.S. foreign policy is often planned and not planned in a public way. And that there may be different maneuvers, different moves toward reconciliation that are in the works that both candidates and both parties are aware of, that we are not going to be aware of until after the elections. But right now, it seems like both parties have determined that blaming China for COVID, that blaming China for America's economic woes, that is a crowd pleaser, and they're trying to one-up each other in being supporters of the current trajectory.
Caleb, we've only got about a minute, but I'm just wondering, and I just want to understand what you're saying. Are you saying that you think that possibly Biden's team may be head faking on China and might possibly take a different path if they come in power, if they come to power? I'm not sure. But like I said, we've got about a minute.
Well, not just Biden's team. I think Trump's team may be doing that as well. And I think that when it gets down to it, there is probably a consensus when it comes to China about how they're going to move. And that maybe Trump and Biden's administration, when it comes to China, I don't really see that much of a difference. But that difference doesn't necessarily mean that both sides will escalate after the elections. There is a planned strategy, which both of them are supporting right now, but that strategy may change after the vote on November 3rd.
So right now, it's a rhetorical strategy versus an actual policy strategy once we get to November 4th.
Indeed. That's my thinking.
I like that thinking. Caleb Maupin, thank you, man. Really appreciate it. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.